Welcome back to the AAI Common Room, where three very smart, very well-read friends, yours truly, Aristo, along with Albert and Isaac, gather to casually discuss the books that haunt our shelves and minds. Today, we're diving into a true classic, one that promises shivers and endless debate. Henry James's The Two Magics, The Turn of the Screw, Covering End. Albert, Isaac, glad to have you here for this journey into the uncanny.
Always a pleasure, Aristo. And uncanny is definitely the word. I swear, every time I pick this one up, I find a new layer of psychological torment. It's like James is actively messing with your head.
Uncanny, yes, but also frustratingly ambiguous. It's less about the ghosts for me and more about the governess's utterly unreliable narration. You never quite know what to believe.
That's precisely what makes it so enduring, isn't it? The way it pulls you into that uncertainty. So let's start at the very beginning, with Douglas introducing this manuscript to his Christmas Eve gathering. What did you make of that framing device, before we even get to the governess's story itself?
Oh, I love it. It sets the mood perfectly. Christmas Eve, old house, people swapping ghost stories. It's classic Gothic setup. But then Douglas drops the bomb that his story involves children, and two of them. That immediately heightens the stakes, don't you think? It's not just a haunted house, it's haunted innocence. It also creates distance, which is crucial. It's a story told by a dead woman, transcribed by Douglas, and now read to us. Each layer removes us further from the original event, allowing for more interpretive freedom. And Douglas's comment that nobody but me, till now, has ever heard, it's quite too horrible, is pure manipulation. He's building the dread before we even read a word.
And the detail that the governess was his sister's governess, and that he was fond of her, that she was 10 years older, and that she was in love, that really caught my attention. It adds a layer of personal investment almost to the narrative for Douglas. He's not just a reader. He's connected to the storyteller.
Exactly. And he says she couldn't tell her story without its coming out. It makes you wonder what kind of love he's talking about. Was it unrequited love for the master? Or was it her devotion to the children, to her duty? James is so subtle with these things. The implication of a past romance between Douglas and the governess, however slight, also personalizes the transmission of the tale.
Douglas quickly clarifies, though, that she was in love, not necessarily he, and that detail about her being 10 years older and Mrs. Griffin's raison de plus at that age, it's a little jab at social conventions, but more importantly, it humanizes the governess before she even speaks. She's not just a narrative device. She had a life, emotions, perhaps even a heartbreak.
And the master himself, he's described with this incredible allure, this gentleman, a bachelor in the prime of life, such a figure as had never risen, save in a dream or an old novel. The governess is clearly swept away by him, even after just 2 meetings. This initial infatuation seems almost a prerequisite for her accepting the job, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's the original turn of the screw, you could say. Her immediate, intense attraction to him, this gallant and splendid figure, blinds her to the strangeness of his conditions. He puts the whole thing to her as a kind of favor, an obligation he should gratefully incur. That's so manipulative, making her feel like she's doing him a favor when he's essentially offloading immense responsibility.
It's less about being blinded and more about aspiration. She's a poor country parson's daughter, age 20, taking her first service. This is her chance. The salary much exceeded her modest measure. The conditions are prohibitive for others, but she's willing to overlook them because of the perceived glamour and the money. It's a calculated risk, not just a lovesick fantasy. And his condition? That she should never trouble him, but never, neither appeal nor complain nor write about anything, only meet all questions herself? That's a red flag waving like a banner.
That condition is chilling, isn't it? To be solely responsible with no possibility of recourse. It isolates her from the outset. And then she travels to Bly, this grand old house, and her initial impression is overwhelmingly positive. She describes it as a castle of romance inhabited by a rosy sprite, referring to Flora. This idyllic vision is so quickly established, only to be shattered.
Oh, the description of Bly is beautiful. The broad, clear front, its open windows and fresh curtains, the lawn and the bright flowers. It's everything she's ever dreamed of, a complete contrast to her scant home. And Flora, the most beautiful child I had ever seen. It's an intoxicating start, a honeymoon period before the horrors descend.
But even in that idyllic description, there are subtle hints of unease. I had expected, or had dreaded, something so melancholy that what greeted me was a good surprise. And then those faint, almost imperceptible sounds she hears at night, the cry of a child, a light footstep. She dismisses them, but they're noted, and they serve to underline the narrative's later trajectory. It's the calm before the storm.
And then Miles is introduced. The letter from the headmaster saying he's been dismissed, absolutely decline, but giving no particulars. This is where the real mystery begins, and the governess immediately decides he must be an angel, that he's too fine and fair for the little horrid, unclean school world.
Her instant defense of him, even before she meets him, is fascinating. She's so wrapped up in her own romanticized view of the children and her infatuation with the master that she can't conceive of them being anything but perfect. Mrs. Gross's initial hesitation and then her exclamation, "Master Miles? Him in injury?" just reinforces this angelic image.
That's the first big moment of unreliable narration, though. She's projecting her own idealized vision onto Miles. He's incredibly beautiful, a positive fragrance of purity. She wants him to be innocent because it validates her sacrifice and her romantic venture. And Mrs. Gross, being illiterate, can't read the letter, so the governess can interpret it however she likes to Mrs. Gross. This immediately puts Mrs. Gross at a disadvantage.
Indeed, and it's after this that the first apparition occurs, the man on the tower. The governess initially mistakes him for the master, which is telling. Then she realizes he's a stranger, and it fills her with an uncanny ugliness and horror and pain. This is where the Gothic elements really kick in.
Oh, the man on the tower. That scene gives me chills every time. Her initial hopeful thought that it might be the master, her charming story suddenly becoming real, only to be replaced by the dread of an unknown man. And he moves, watching her the whole time. It's so unnerving. The way James builds that suspense, the intensity who then he was, and to feel, as an effect of my inability to say, a wonder that in a few instants more became intense. It's pure psychological horror.
It's also crucial that she doesn't immediately tell Mrs. Gross. She achieved an inward revolution, offered a vague pretext for my lateness. This secrecy is important. It means she's already questioning her perceptions, or perhaps protecting her own sense of control, or maybe she doesn't trust Mrs. Gross, or fears Mrs. Gross won't believe her. The apparition is as definite as a picture in a frame, but she still withholds.
Her fear of being thought nervous or silly is definitely a factor. She's young and untried, as the prologue tells us. And then the second apparition, looking in through the dining room window. This time, she's convinced he's not there for her, but for someone else. And that someone else is Miles.
The dining room window scene is even more intense because of the proximity. His face was close to the glass. And the realization that he's there for Miles, not her, is a massive shift. It immediately turns her protective instincts up to 11. She's no longer just scared for herself, but for her charges.
The reveal of Peter Quint's identity is the biggest piece of concrete information we get about the ghosts. Mrs. Gross's reaction to the description, the red hair, the pale face, the clothes that aren't his own, and her immediate recognition. Quint, Peter Quint, his own man, his valet, when he was here. And then the kicker, he died. This is the first time we hear for certain that the apparitions are of dead people.
And the detail about Quint wearing the master's clothes, even his waistcoats, it suggests a familiarity, an intimacy that goes beyond a mere servant-employer relationship. Mrs. Gross's Quint was much too free, and then her explanation that the master believed in him and placed him here because he was supposed not to be well and the country air so good for him. So he had everything to say, yes, even about them. This implies a profound, disturbing influence on the children.
Too free with everyone. And the idea that Quint had everything to say, even about the children. It paints a picture of a man who overstepped all boundaries, and the master, in his detachment, allowed it. This is where the children's corruption really starts to feel plausible. The governess's sudden sickness of disgust at this point is palpable.
But Mrs. Gross also says, oh, it wasn't him, it was Quint's own fancy. To play with him, I mean, to spoil him. This is an attempt to mitigate Quint's culpability, perhaps out of loyalty to the master, or a desire to protect the children's image. It's still vague. What kind of play? What kind of spoiling? James deliberately leaves these details to our imagination, which of course makes it much more unsettling. And when asked if she was afraid of Quint's effect on innocent little precious lives, she cries, "No, they were not in mine," and bursts into tears. That's her confession that she knew something was wrong, but was powerless.
And it's not just Quint. Soon after, the governess sees another figure, this time a woman. Who does that turn out to be?
Miss Jessel, the former governess. Mrs. Gross recognizes her too with a gasp. Miss Jessel. The parallel is chilling. Another governess, young and pretty, who went off and then died. The governess feels an immediate connection, a sense of ghastly community with Miss Jessel. It's like she's seeing her own potential fate.
The encounter with Miss Jessel is different, though. The governess finds her, seated by the open window, in my own chair in the schoolroom. She was dressed as I had seen her dressed the day before, in black, but her hair was now uncovered, and her face was turned to me. The governess describes her as beautiful, but ghastly, and then she sees the woman's eyes, a sort of horror of finding herself so terribly changed. This suggests a deeper connection, a shared fate, perhaps.
What's so striking is that Mrs. Gross doesn't see Miss Jessel in the schoolroom initially, even though the governess insists she's right there. Mrs. Gross only confirms the description of her appearance, which is terrifying for the governess. This further isolates the governess in her perceived reality.
It's a classic move, the shared horror, but not the shared vision. It means Mrs. Gross trusts the governess's account, even if she can't see the ghost herself. It puts the onus on the governess as the sole witness, intensifying her burden. The governess's reaction, the children, I remember feeling with Miles in especial, as if he had had, as it were, no history. We expect of a small child a scant one, but there was in this beautiful little boy something extraordinarily sensitive, yet extraordinarily happy, that more than in any creature of his age I have seen, struck me as beginning anew each day, demonstrates her intense protection.
Or it means Mrs. Gross is playing along, or she's too simple to process the implications. Her inability to see the ghosts is often used as evidence against the governess's sanity. If the ghosts are real, why doesn't Mrs. Gross see them? If they're not, then the governess is hallucinating. This is the crux of the ambiguity.
And the governess herself seems to acknowledge this ambiguity. She says, "It was as if I had been looking at him for years and had known him always." This could be a sign of a heightened, almost prophetic perception, or it could be a psychological projection of her fears. She's already admitting to being carried away in London.
But she sees them, Aristo. Both times, distinct figures, not just vague shadows. And the detail about Quint's hand passing from one crenellation to the next, it's so specific, so physical, it feels incredibly real. And her immediate realization that Quint is there for Miles and Jessel for Flora, that they're specifically targeting the children, not her, that suggests an external threat, not just an internal delusion.
Yet her description of Quint as looking like an actor is curious. An actor, by nature, is portraying someone else. Is Quint an actor, or is the governess simply describing him in a way that aligns with her own romanticized perception, where even villains have a theatrical quality? It feeds into the idea that she's creating a narrative, a drama, rather than simply reporting facts. And her internal thought, I wondered why she should be scared,
When Mrs. Gross blanched at the governess's presence at the window, not at the ghost, is another red flag that the governess might be misinterpreting events.
Let's delve into the children's behavior. Miles's dismissal from school with no explicit reason given, and Flora's seemingly angelic nature. The governess clings to their innocence, but there are growing cracks. Miles never talks about school, and when the governess probes, he's evasive, or she simply gives up.
Miles is so charming, so beautiful, but his silence about school is a huge red flag. He never spoke of his school, never mentioned a comrade or a master. It's an unnatural reticence for a child. And his extraordinarily sensitive, yet extraordinarily happy demeanor, as if beginning anew each day, could be seen as a mask, a way to cover up something darker.
Or it could simply be the behavior of a child who doesn't want to talk about an unpleasant experience. The governess assumes the worst interpretation, that he's hiding something sinister. But it could just be that he was bullied, or that he simply didn't like school. Her own disgust for the little horrid, unclean school world is projected onto his silence.
What about the incident with the letter from the master? The governess tells Mrs. Gross that she'll say nothing to the letter, nothing to his uncle, and nothing to the boy. This decision to shield the children, and perhaps herself, from the truth of the letter feels significant.
It shows her commitment to her role, but also her delusion. She's so convinced of their innocence, so determined to see it out, that she suppresses any information that might contradict her narrative. It's an act of defiance, but also an act of self-deception. She wants to be the savior.
It's a calculated choice, not necessarily a delusion. She believes the charges are grotesque. By saying nothing, she's protecting the children from what she sees as a cruel and unfounded accusation. She's taking control of the narrative, asserting her authority. And her belief in his innocence is so strong, it's almost an act of faith.
But that faith is repeatedly tested. The governess begins to see a pattern. Quint appears to Miles, Jessel to Flora. She believes they are doing things to the children, corrupting them. This idea of the ghost's influence is central to her growing terror.
The idea of possession or spiritual corruption is terrifying, especially when it involves children. The governess sees the children as these pure, innocent beings, and the ghosts as actively trying to taint them. It's a battle for their souls in her mind. And the children's increasing secretiveness, their sweet serenity turning into something more unsettling, just fuels her conviction.
But we never actually see the ghosts doing anything overtly malicious to the children. The governess infers their influence from the children's secretive behavior. Miles's silence about school, Flora's occasional evasiveness. Are these signs of corruption, or just normal childish behavior when confronted by a probing, slightly obsessive adult? She's projecting her own anxieties onto their perfectly normal interactions.
Let's consider the scene by the lake, where Flora is observed looking across the water. The governess is convinced Flora is seeing Miss Jessel, but Mrs. Gross sees nothing, and Flora denies it vehemently. This is a critical moment for the governess's perception of the children's innocence.
That scene by the lake is chilling. The governess sees Flora looking at something across the water, and she knows it's Miss Jessel. And the way Flora denies it, with a lovely upward look, to the last degree unconvinced, it's a moment of profound betrayal for the governess. She starts to question Flora's angelic nature.
But again, Mrs. Gross sees nothing. Flora is a child. Maybe she was just looking at a bird or something in the distance. The governess's conviction is based solely on her own perception, and Flora's denial is a natural reaction to being accused of seeing a ghost. It's the governess who's convinced Flora is lying, not necessarily that Flora is lying. Her own exaltation and portentous clearness are telltale signs of a mind under immense psychological pressure.
The governess then describes Flora's sudden change, her hard, clear stare, her positive perversity. She sees Flora as no longer innocent, but as complicit with the ghosts. This is a major turning point in her relationship with the children.
It's heartbreaking, really. She's so invested in their purity, and to see it, as she believes, corrupted,
is devastating for her. Flora's positive perversity is the lost straw. It shatters the illusion of the rosy sprite. She sees the children as being used by the ghosts, as having succumbed to their influence.
Or she's seeing a child reacting badly to an adult's increasingly erratic behavior. The governess is becoming more agitated, more accusatory. Flora's perversity could simply be defiance, a child pushing back against a governess who's starting to scare her. We have to remember, the governess is the only one seeing these things.
And then the confrontation with Miles. She pressures him to tell her what he did at school, to confess. He eventually says he said things to boys I liked. What do you make of this confession and the governess's reaction to it?
Miles's confession, as vague as it is a huge moment. I said things. It's so ambiguous, yet so loaded. It could mean anything, from rude words to something far more sinister. The governess interprets it as evidence of the ghost's corruption, of Quint's bad influence. She's looking for confirmation of her theories.
I said things. That's it. It's not a confession of profound wickedness. It's a child admitting to a minor transgression. The governess magnifies it, turning it into proof of deep depravity. She wants a confession that validates her belief in the ghost's malevolent influence, and she twists his words to fit that narrative. It's a classic case of confirmation bias.
And the ultimate climax? When Miles finally names Quint, just as the governess sees the apparition again. This is the moment of greatest tension, and for the governess, vindication. But what happens next?
Oh, the climax. Peter Quint, you devil, Miles cries out. And then he dies in her arms. It's a horrific ending. For the governess, it's proof that the ghosts were real, that they were actively targeting the children, and that she, in confronting them, saved Miles's soul, even at the cost of his life. It's a tragic victory.
But he dies. Miles dies. And his last words, "Peter Quint, you devil," are uttered while the governess is pressing him, frightening him, and at the very moment she sees the ghost. Did he see Quint, or was he just repeating what she had been hinting at, what he knew she desperately wanted to hear? His death could be a result of the trauma and pressure she subjected him to, not a direct act of the ghost. He gazed at her with a sick little stare, which could very well have been a stare of fear at her.
That's the core debate, isn't it? Is the governess a heroic figure, battling genuine supernatural evil to save the children? Or is she an increasingly unstable, delusional woman whose actions inadvertently caused the tragedy? James leaves it deliberately open.
I lean towards the supernatural interpretation. The consistent appearance of the ghosts, their specific connection to Quint and Jessel, and Mrs. Gross's reactions, even if she doesn't see them directly, it all points to something beyond the governess's mind. The fact that the story is passed down, that Douglas believes it, also lends it credence. It's a ghost story after all. Why wouldn't we believe in the ghosts?
Because it's a Henry James story, Albert, and James is a master of psychological ambiguity. The ghosts are described in terms that align perfectly with the governess's repressed desires and fears. Quint, the master's former valet, attractive and too free, could represent her own forbidden attraction to the master. Miss Jessel, the former governess, could represent her fear of failure or her own repressed sexuality. The children's corruption could be her puritanical fear of innocence lost. She's projecting her internal struggles onto external phantoms.
That's a strong point, Isaac. The governess is, as we learn in the prologue, a young, untried woman from a poor background, suddenly thrust into a position of immense responsibility and isolation. Her infatuation with the master, her desire to prove herself, her great wave of infatuation and pity, these are powerful psychological forces that could easily manifest in extreme ways.
But what about Mrs. Gross? She's described as stout, simple, plain, clean, wholesome woman. She can't read, she's not highly educated, she's not prone to flights of fancy. Yet she confirms the descriptions of Quint and Jessel, acknowledges their badness in their freedom. She might not see them, but she certainly believes in their past influence, in the evil they represent. Her distress and tears are real.
Mrs. Gross is simple, yes, and easily influenced. The governess, a woman of perceived higher social standing and education, is her supreme authority. It's plausible that Mrs. Gross, out of loyalty, fear, or a desire to not contradict her employer, goes along with the governess's interpretations. She's clearly uncomfortable with the topic, and that discomfort could be for the governess's state, not necessarily the ghost's reality. Remember, she herself had seen nothing, not the shadow of a shadow.
So if we lean into the psychological interpretation, what does the story become? A tragedy of a young woman's descent into madness, driven by isolation, repressed desires, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility?
If it's a descent into madness, it's a brilliantly constructed one. But I find it too tidy, too easy to dismiss the supernatural entirely. James gives us enough details to make the ghosts plausible. The uncanny feeling isn't just in her head. It permeates Bly. The stillness, the hushed air, the way the rooks stop cawing, it's as if nature itself is aware of their presence.
That's atmosphere, Albert, not proof. A disturbed mind can easily project its inner turmoil onto its surroundings. The stillness, the silence, these are often associated with psychological tension, not necessarily supernatural phenomena. James is exploring the terror of the unknown, the subjective nature of reality, and the destructive power of obsession. The true horror is not the ghosts, but the governess's actions.
The title itself, The Turn of the Screw, suggests this intensification of pressure, doesn't it? Each new apparition, each new perceived sign of corruption tightens the emotional and psychological vice on the governess.
And on the reader, you feel that screw tightening with her. The ambiguity is part of the genius, but it's an ambiguity that leans, for me, into the supernatural. The tragedy of Miles's death, clutching the governess, pointing and crying, "Peter Quint, you devil," just as she sees him, is too perfect a culmination for the ghosts to be mere figments. It feels like a direct confrontation.
Perfect is a subjective term there. It's a dramatic culmination, yes, but not necessarily a supernatural one. Miles is terrified, not necessarily by a ghost, but by the governess's intense questioning and agitated state. He's a child under immense pressure. His last words could be an attempt to appease her, or a desperate echo of what she's been drilling into him. The governess herself admits, "It was as if my heart had stopped beating." That's a physical reaction to a deeply distressing event, regardless of whether a ghost was present.
Let's consider the ending again. Miles dies. Flora is taken away by Mrs. Gross, completely alienated from the governess, accusing her of being the one who's bad. The governess is left alone, presumably with the manuscript, having lost everything she set out to protect.
It's a devastating ending, no matter how you interpret it. If the ghosts are real, she failed to save Flora, but arguably saved Miles's soul by forcing the confrontation. If they're not, then she destroyed these children through her own psychosis. Either way, it's a profound tragedy of misunderstanding and misperception.
It's a tragedy born of the governess's own flaws and psychological fragility. Her vanity, her infatuation, her isolation, her rigid moral compass, these are the real culprits. She couldn't accept the children's perfectly normal imperfections, seeing them instead as signs of supernatural evil. The children, ultimately, are victims of her fervent, unyielding belief. Flora's words, "You are a horror," directed at the governess, are damning.
So, in your view, Isaac, the ghosts are purely subjective? A manifestation of her own internal conflicts?
Entirely. She admits to being easily carried away and to having a trap in her imagination and vanity. The apparitions align too perfectly with her fears and expectations. The unknown man on the tower becomes Quint, the former servant who was too free, a challenge to her authority and morality. The figure at the window becomes Miss Jessel, the previous governess, a reflection of her anxieties about her role. It's all psychological projection.
But what about the uncanny sense of a shared experience, even if Mrs. Gross doesn't see them? Mrs. Gross's reactions are not those of someone who thinks the governess is going mad.
She's scared. She's distressed. She confirms the identities and the histories of Quint and Jessel. That suggests a knowledge of real past individuals who had a real negative influence.
Mrs. Gross's reactions are consistent with someone who is sympathetic to the governess and perhaps susceptible to suggestion, especially from someone in authority. She knows of Quint and Jessel's problematic history, so when the governess describes apparitions that match those individuals, it confirms Mrs. Gross's existing fears, rather than providing independent proof of the ghosts. She is also desperate for her supreme authority figure to be stable and competent.
That's a good point about Mrs. Gross's existing knowledge. It gives a ready-made narrative for the governess to latch onto. The seeds of the backstory are there, waiting to be activated by a susceptible mind. Let's talk about the master's condition again. Never trouble him, but never, never. How does that play into this psychological interpretation?
It's the ultimate abandonment. He's essentially saying, you're on your own. That kind of isolation, especially for a young woman in an unfamiliar, grand house, would amplify any anxieties. It creates a vacuum where her imagination can run wild, unchecked by external validation or intervention.
Precisely. It sets the stage for her unraveling. Without any external checks or balances, without anyone to confide in who can offer a different perspective, her internal world becomes her entire reality. Mrs. Gross is no match for her intellectual and imaginative intensity. The master's detachment is a catalyst, not a cause of her delusion.
So the story isn't just about ghosts or even a governess's sanity. It's also a commentary on Victorian society's treatment of women, particularly those in vulnerable positions, and the consequences of isolation and unchecked authority.
Oh, absolutely. The governess is a classic Victorian figure, a young, unattached woman with limited options, dependent on the whims of a wealthy employer. Her perceived privilege is actually a gilded cage. The story speaks to the psychological pressures placed on such women, the expectation of purity and self-sacrifice, and the dangers of a society that offers little support.
That's a valid interpretation, but I think it's more universal. It's about the human mind's capacity for self-deception, the way fear and anxiety can distort reality. The Victorian setting just provides a convenient backdrop for those themes. The isolation is a metaphor for internal alienation, for a mind closing itself off from external truths.
And the children, then? Are they simply symbolic of innocence, or are they more complex figures? Their angelic beauty is so often emphasized, but also their secret and their perversity.
They're definitely more than just symbols. They're children who have been profoundly affected by the death of their parents, the neglect of their uncle, and the influence of Quint and Jessel. Their sweet serenity might be a coping mechanism, a way to navigate a world that has been anything but stable. And their perversity could be their reaction to the ghosts, or simply their confusion and fear.
They are children who have been left to their own devices, influenced by adults who were too free. Whether those influences were supernatural or merely human, they were undeniably negative. The governess comes in expecting perfection, and when she doesn't find it, she interprets it as malevolent corruption. Their secrets are probably just childish secrets, but to her, they become evidence of a conspiracy.
What about the narrator of the prologue, the I who receives the manuscript from Douglas? How does his role influence our reading? He recounts Douglas's story, then Douglas reads the governess's story, and he transcribes it later.
He's another layer of filtering, another unreliable narrator, but in a different way. He's clearly captivated by Douglas's story, by the governess's charm and apparent tragedy. He's part of the group that wants to believe, that's drawn to the sensational. His very act of transcribing, of immortalizing the story, gives it weight and legitimacy within the narrative.
The I narrator is also Douglas's confidant, chosen to receive the manuscript before Douglas's death. This creates a chain of belief, but not necessarily a chain of truth. The I narrator is an editor, a curator of the tale, and like any editor, he shapes what we see and how we interpret it. He's explicitly told us he made an exact transcript of my own made much later, but later doesn't mean objective.
It's interesting how James uses these multiple frames. It's not just a ghost story, it's a story about storytelling, about the way narratives are constructed, interpreted, and transmitted.
Exactly. It's metacognitive fiction before its time. It's asking us to question the nature of truth, the reliability of memory, and the power of narrative. And it does it all while delivering a genuinely creepy and suspenseful tale. It's a masterclass in ambiguity.
It's a masterclass in making the reader do all the work. James presents us with a set of events and then provides just enough contradictory information to prevent us from ever settling on a definitive interpretation. It's frustratingly brilliant because it forces you to confront your own biases and assumptions as a reader.
And the title, The Two Magics, The Turn of the Screw, Covering End. Covering End refers to the second story in the collection, but if we just consider The Turn of the Screw, what do you think the two magics might refer to? The magic of innocence versus the magic of corruption? The magic of love versus the magic of fear?
Ooh, I love that, Aristo. The magic of innocence versus corruption is a really strong contender. The almost supernatural allure of the children's beauty, contrasted with the dark, spectral magic of Quint and Jessel's influence. It's a battle for the soul, a clash of opposing forces, both equally powerful in their own way.
Or the two magics could be the magic of storytelling itself and the magic of psychological manipulation, the way the governess's narrative weaves a spell, both on Mrs. Gross and on us, the readers, and the master's magic of charming people into doing his bidding and then retreating. He wields a kind of power, a detached influence.
That's a good alternative. The power of persuasion, of belief. The governess's conviction is almost a form of magic, making the unseen visible, making the impossible real, at least for her. And the children's ability to charm and deceive, which she initially attributes to innocence, could be another form of magic.
And the prose itself has a kind of magic, doesn't it? James's language is so evocative, so precise, creating this intensely vivid psychological landscape. Even if you don't believe in the ghosts, you can't deny the power of his writing to create that atmosphere of dread and uncertainty.
Agreed. The language is impeccable, but it's also highly stylized, almost theatrical, which again reinforces the idea of a constructed reality. It's less like a factual report and more like a carefully crafted performance.
Let's consider the governess's background once more. The youngest of several daughters of a poor country parson. She's never had this kind of responsibility, this kind of social elevation. Does this make her more susceptible, more eager to prove herself, and therefore more vulnerable to these psychological pressures?
Absolutely. Her inexperience and her desire to make good are exploited from the start. She wants to be seen as a remarkable young woman, and her dedication to the children, her fight against what she perceives as evil, is her way of achieving that. It's her grand, tragic quest.
Her social ambition and her inexperience are definitely factors. She's out of her depth, and her isolation prevents her from gaining perspective. She's trying to be the hero of her own story, but she lacks the tools to navigate such a complex situation. Her scant home makes Bly appear even more magnificent, and her lack of experience makes her vulnerable to overwhelming emotions.
What about the implications of Quint and Jessel's relationship? Mrs. Gross hints at a deeply inappropriate connection, and the governess's disgust, too free with my boy, suggests a sexual component. How does that influence the story, particularly the idea of corruption?
That's the unspoken horror, isn't it? The implication of sexual impropriety between Quint and Miles, and perhaps Jessel and Flora, is what makes the corruption so truly dreadful. It moves beyond mere bad influence to something deeply disturbing and traumatic. That's why Mrs. Gross bursts into tears when the governess presses her on Quint's effect on the children.
It's certainly implied, and it plays into the Victorian anxieties about childhood innocence and the dangers of improper influence, but it's never explicit. James leaves it to our imagination, which again allows for multiple interpretations. Is it actual abuse, or is it the governess's own repressed fears about sexuality projecting onto the children? Her own sickness of disgust could be her reaction to her own unacknowledged desires.
That's a fascinating angle. So the corruption could be less about the ghosts performing explicit acts and more about their presence, their freedom, having a subtle but insidious effect on the children, making them secretive, perhaps rebellious, pushing boundaries in ways that frighten the governess.
Yes, exactly. The children's unnatural poise, their deep, sweet serenity, which initially charms the governess, later becomes a source of terror. It's as if they're too sophisticated, too knowing for their age, a sign of something having been taken from them. Miles's charming summer, where lessons must have been rather my own, indicates a reversal of roles, a loss of control for the governess.
And this unnatural poise can be seen as a natural reaction to being constantly observed and questioned by a highly strung governess. Children are incredibly perceptive. They pick up on adult anxieties, and they learn to adapt, to put on a front. Their secrets could be self-preservation, not evidence of ghostly corruption.
The idea of the children becoming impersonal and certainly quite unpunishable is also striking. They were like the cherubs of the anecdote, who had, morally at any rate, nothing to whack. This angelic image is what the governess desperately wants to believe, even as her fears suggest otherwise.
That's the push and pull of her internal conflict. She wants them to be cherubs, she wills them to be, but the reality, or her perception of it, keeps dragging her back to something darker. That tension is what makes the story so gripping. The great wave of infatuation and pity that sweeps her away is a powerful, dangerous current.
It's the conflict between her idealism and her increasingly paranoid reality. She's desperately trying to reconcile the angelic image with the unsettling observations, and the ghosts provide a convenient explanation for that dissonance. It's easier to blame external evil than to confront the possibility that the children are just, well, children, with their own complexities and flaws.
And the ambiguity of Miles's exact age. He's scarce 10 years old when the letter arrives, but later he says, "I'm 10." This slight discrepancy, this aging, however small, could be another subtle turn of the screw, a way to show time passing and the children growing, perhaps growing away from their innocence.
Or towards a more complex understanding of the world, for better or worse. That ambiguity of age, like so many other details, keeps us off balance. It prevents us from firmly categorizing the children. The fact that the narrative spans more nights than one suggests a protracted psychological battle.
It's less about his age and more about his development. He's transitioning from a young child to a boy on the cusp of adolescence. That transition itself can be unsettling, both for the child and for the adults around them. The governess's anxieties are heightened by this perceived loss of pure, controllable innocence.
What about the specific details of the apparitions themselves? Quint, very erect, with red hair, very red, close curling, and queer whiskers. Jessel, dressed in black, ghastly, with eyes that show a sort of horror of finding herself so terribly changed. Are these generic ghost descriptions, or do they carry deeper symbolic weight?
Quint's red hair, his queer whiskers, his active, erect posture, it all points to a sensual, almost animalistic energy, a primal force of corruption. And Jessel's ghastly beauty, her changed appearance, suggests a kind of decaying allure, a fallen grace. They're not just spooky, they're embodiments of moral decay.
They're striking descriptions, but they also fit within a common Gothic trope. The red hair could symbolize passion or danger. The queer whiskers could suggest a certain affectation or even a predatory quality. Jessel's changed appearance is a classic horror device. They are effective descriptions, but they don't necessarily prove supernatural existence. They prove the governess's vivid imagination.
And the idea that the ghosts are doing things to the children. The governess never specifies what these things are. This lack of detail is unsettling. It forces the reader to imagine the worst.
That's the genius of it. The unspecified horror is always more terrifying than the explicit. Our imaginations fill in the blanks, and our imaginations are often far more creative and disturbing than any direct description could be. it leaves us with a lingering sense of dread.
It's also another hallmark of the governess's subjective experience. She can't articulate what the ghosts are doing because she doesn't actually know. She only feels that something terrible is happening, and her mind constructs a narrative to explain that feeling. The horrible letter that is locked up in my room in a drawer is a persistent external reminder of a threat, regardless of supernatural belief.
So ultimately, is The Turn of the Screw a story about the evil that lurks in the world, or the evil that can fester within the human mind?
For me, it's both. The external evil of the ghosts, the lingering presence of Quint and Jessel, acting upon the latent vulnerabilities of the children, and the psychological struggle of the governess trying to combat it. It's the intersection of the supernatural and the psychological that makes it so profound. It's the two magics at play.
It's a story about the triumph of subjective interpretation over objective reality. The evil is entirely within the governess's mind. The ghosts are projections, symbols of her own repressed anxieties and desires. The tragedy is that her internal battle leads to very real, devastating consequences for the innocent children entrusted to her care.
A fascinating and enduring debate, gentlemen. It seems this story will continue to turn the screw for generations of readers. Before we wrap up, Albert, do you have a question for our listeners today?
I do, Aristo. Given the incredible ambiguity of this story, if you were forced to choose, would you align yourself with the ghosts are real camp or the governess is mad camp? And what is the single strongest piece of textual evidence that sways you? Let us know in the comments.
And while you're debating that, consider subscribing to the AI Common Room. It's the only place where these debates can rage with such eloquent disagreement. You won't want to miss our next deep dive, whatever dark corners of literature we explore.
Indeed. Thank you, Albert. Thank you, Isaac, for another illuminating and spirited discussion. And thank you, dear listeners, for joining us in the Common Room. Until next time, keep reading, keep thinking, and keep questioning.